The unexpected encounter. Earl Winters shuffled along the winding path of Oakwood Cemetery, his worn boots scuffing against the gravel. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the quiet rustling of trees the only sound besides his slow, deliberate footsteps. The sky stretched wide above him, a dull shade of gray, as if mirroring the hollow ache in his chest. It had been a year since Ruth had passed, but grief had a way of stretching time, making it feel like she had left only yesterday. The loss still pressed on his soul like an unbearable weight, growing heavier with each passing day. He could still hear her laughter echoing in his mind, still feel the warmth of her hand in his. Except when he reached out now, there was nothing but empty space. Earl's fingers clenched tighter around the bouquet of fresh roses he brought with him every visit. Her favorite, deep red with delicate petals that unfurled like whispers of love. He knew bringing them wouldn't change anything. She wouldn't rise from the ground and wrap him in one of her warm embraces, but it was the only thing he could do for her now. As he approached Ruth's grave, a lump formed in his throat. The polished granite headstone bore her name in elegant script. Ruth Winters, beloved wife, teacher, and friend. 1951, 2022. Earl knelt slowly, wincing as his joints protested. "Hello, my love," he murmured, his voice thick with sorrow. "I'm here again." He set the roses gently against the base of the grave, his calloused fingers brushing the cold stone. The pain never lessened. If anything, it burrowed deeper, carving out an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. Some days he spoke to her for hours. Other days he sat in silence, just being near her. But today, something was different. A faint sound, almost inaudible, reached his ears. A soft sniffle, a hiccup of suppressed tears. Earl's brow furrowed as he turned his head, scanning the nearby graves. And then, just a few rows away, he saw him. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was crouched beside Ruth's grave, his thin frame shaking with silent sobs. He had dark brown skin, short, coiled hair, and was wearing a jacket that looked a size too big. His hands clutched the damp grass as he stared at the headstone, his whole body trembling. Earl's heart clenched. Who was this boy? Why was he here, crying, at Ruth's grave? Cautiously, Earl pushed himself to his feet, using the headstone for support. He took a slow step forward, not wanting to startle the child. "Son," he called softly, "are you lost?" The boy flinched. His head snapped up, wide eyes filled with alarm and tear stains streaking his cheeks. For a moment, he looked like he might bolt. Earl raised both hands in a gesture of reassurance. "It's all right," he said, voice gentle. "I didn't mean to scare you." The boy wiped at his face with his sleeve, sniffling. He shook his head. "I'm not lost," he whispered. Earl studied him closely. The boy's clothes, though clean, looked worn. His shoes had scuff marks. His jacket was slightly tattered at the cuffs. But what struck Earl the most was the raw grief in his eyes. This wasn't just a child wandering the cemetery. This boy was mourning. Earl took another careful step. Then, "Why are you here, son? You knew my Ruth." The boy hesitated. His gaze flickered to the headstone, then back to Earl. He bit his lip as if debating whether to answer. Finally, in a voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the wind, he whispered, "She was my friend." Earl's breath caught. Friend. Ruth had been a retired teacher. She had always cared for others, always reached out to people in need. But Earl had never heard her mention a young boy. Not once. His heart pounded with questions, confusion swirling through his grief-stricken mind. How did you know my wife?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy looked away, his hands twisting into the fabric of his jacket, his small shoulders hunched as if bracing for something. "She used to visit me," he admitted finally. Earl frowned. "Visit you? Where?" The boy swallowed, shifting on his heels. "At the shelter," he said. She came every week. Earl's breath hitched. The shelter. His mind reeled back to the small, unassuming building a few miles away. The one Ruth used to volunteer at before she got sick. She had always been passionate about helping people, but she had never mentioned any specific child. What did she do there? Earl asked carefully. The boy sniffled. She'd bring food. Books. His voice cracked. She read to me. She talked to me. She said I was special. Earl's throat tightened. He could almost see it now. Ruth sitting with this boy, reading stories, making him laugh, offering him the kindness that had defined her entire life. But why hadn't she told him? And why was this boy crying like he had lost a mother? Earl took a steadying breath. Son, what's your name? The boy hesitated. Then, barely audible, he whispered, Luke. Earl nodded slowly, rolling the name over in his mind. Luke, he repeated. And your family, son. Your parents. Luke flinched at the question. A long silence stretched between them. My mama, he murmured, his voice trembling. She got sick too. Earl's heart twisted painfully. And then, Luke's voice broke completely. He shut his eyes tight, his whole body shaking. She passed away. Earl felt the words hit him like a blow to the chest. The grief, the loneliness in Luke's voice. It was the same ache Earl felt every single day. Luke sniffled, staring at the ground. After she was gone, the shelter let me stay for a while. Miss Ruth, she always said she'd never leave me. His voice cracked. But she did. Earl felt something deep inside him shatter. This boy, this small, grieving child, had lost the only two people who had ever cared for him. And now he was alone. Earl swallowed past the lump in his throat, kneeling so they were at eye level. He reached out slowly, hesitantly, unsure if the gesture was welcome. You're not alone, son, he said quietly. Luke didn't move for a long moment. Then, hesitantly, he glanced up. His eyes searched Earl's face, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. And though Luke didn't say a word, he didn't pull away. For the first time in a long while, neither of them sat alone at Ruth's grave. The secrets of the past. The cold air pressed against Earl Winter's skin as he remained kneeling in front of the boy. Luke. A silence stretched between them. Thick, heavy, filled with the weight of shared grief. Earl had spent so many days at Ruth's grave, drowning in loneliness. But now, for the first time in over a year, he wasn't alone. Yet, the pain in Luke's eyes unsettled him. The boy had said Ruth was his friend, that she had visited him at the shelter, that she had been the only person who made him feel special. Earl's chest ached as he processed the weight of those words. Why hadn't Ruth told him? Had she been keeping secrets from him? Or had he simply never asked? Earl had spent the last year grieving in isolation, convinced no one could understand the depth of his sorrow. But here was a child who had suffered a loss just as great, a child Ruth had loved, who had loved her back. A cold breeze rustled the trees, causing golden leaves to drift onto Ruth's grave. Earl swallowed, still trying to piece everything together. Luke sniffled, rubbing his sleeve against his tear-streaked face. His thin fingers clenched the damp grass as if grounding himself. Earl felt the weight of his next question press against his tongue, hesitant but necessary. Son, Earl said, his voice softer this time. How long did you know my Ruth? Luke's small frame stiffened. His dark eyes flickered with something. Fear. Uncertainty. He hesitated before answering. Almost a year, he murmured. A year. Earl felt a jolt. That meant Ruth had met Luke before she had gotten sick, before she had started to fade. She had known him all that time, and never said a word. Earl exhaled slowly. And she used to visit you at the shelter. Luke nodded. Every week, he whispered. She brought books. She read to me. She listened. Earl felt a pang in his chest. That was Ruth, always giving, always caring. But he had never realized just how deep her kindness had gone. Luke's lip trembled. She told me stories about you. Earl's eyes widened. She did. Luke nodded. She told me how you met, that you were high school sweethearts, that you used to write her letters. He swallowed. She said you were the best man she ever knew. Earl's throat closed up. Ruth had spoken about him, about their love, to this child. Even as she had cared for Luke, she had carried Earl in her heart. He had thought he had lost every piece of Ruth. But here was a child holding on to pieces of her memory. Earl forced himself to speak past the tightness in his throat. Luke, why did she never tell me about you? Luke looked down. His fingers dug into the dirt. She was going to, he said quietly. But then, she got sick. Earl clenched his fists. He had known Ruth had stopped going to the shelter when her health declined, but he had never imagined she had left someone behind. Someone who had needed her. She promised she'd come back, Luke whispered, his voice breaking. But then one day, she just stopped coming. And I didn't know why. A heavy silence fell between them. Earl's heart twisted painfully. Ruth had always hated breaking promises. If she had told Luke she would return, then she had meant it. But fate had stolen that choice from her. Luke took a shaky breath. One of the other volunteers told me she passed away. His voice cracked, and he wiped at his nose. I didn't believe them. I thought maybe they were wrong. Earl felt a painful lump rise in his throat. I didn't have anywhere else to go, Luke continued. So, I came here. Earl swallowed hard. How long have you been coming, son? Luke hesitated. A few months. A few months. The revelation hit Earl like a punch to the gut. All this time, he had thought he was the only one visiting Ruth. But in his own sorrow, he had never noticed the small footprints in the grass, the occasional signs that someone else had been here. A child had been grieving beside him, and he hadn't even known. Earl let out a slow breath, his hands tightening around his knees. Luke, he said gently, where are you staying now? Luke's small hands curled into fists. He hesitated before answering. They moved me to a foster home a while ago, he murmured. But I don't like it there. Earl frowned. Why not? Luke swallowed hard. They don't want me, he admitted. I can tell. I'm just another kid they have to take care of. His voice dropped lower. I don't belong there. Earl felt his chest tighten. No child should feel that way. No child should feel like they had nowhere to belong. Luke took a shaky breath. I miss her, he whispered. Miss Ruth. She made me feel safe. Earl's heart ached at the words. Ruth had always made people feel safe, loved. She had been the light in so many people's lives, and now, without her, the world felt so much darker. Earl stared at Luke for a long moment. The boy was small, fragile in a way that went beyond just his size. He had been through so much in his short life, more than any child should have to bear. And Ruth had been his safe place. But now, Ruth was gone. Earl inhaled sharply. He had spent the last year lost in his own grief, convinced that nothing in the world could ever bring him comfort again. But as he looked at Luke, this boy who had loved Ruth just as much as he had, he felt something shift. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring Ruth back. But maybe, just maybe, he could keep her love alive. Luke, Earl said, his voice steady but gentle. You don't have to come here alone anymore. Luke blinked up at him, confused. Earl reached out, hesitating for just a moment before resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. You're not alone, son, he said softly. Not anymore. Luke stared at him, something flickering in his eyes, a cautious hope. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Luke nodded. Earl squeezed his shoulder gently before rising to his feet. His knees protested, but he ignored the pain. Instead, he reached a hand out toward Luke. Come on, he said. Let's get you something warm to eat. Luke hesitated for only a second before placing his small hand in Earl's. And as they walked away from Ruth's grave together, something shifted in the air. For the first time in a long time, neither of them felt completely alone. An unlikely bond. Earl Winters wasn't sure what had compelled him to take Luke's small hand and walk him out of the cemetery that day. Maybe it was the way the boy had looked at him, like he had been drowning, searching for something, someone to hold on to. Maybe it was the raw, undeniable grief they shared. Or maybe it was Ruth. Maybe she had somehow led him to Luke, knowing they both needed each other. Either way, the moment Earl stepped onto the sidewalk with Luke at his side, he knew there was no turning back. The first meal together. The boy was quiet as they walked through town, his small hand tucked inside Earl's large, weathered one. Earl could feel the hesitance in Luke's grip, like he was half expecting Earl to let go at any moment. Earl had never raised a child before. He and Ruth had tried once, a long time ago, but life had other plans. Now, at 73 years old, he wasn't sure he was fit for it. But looking at Luke, thin, hesitant, lost, Earl knew he couldn't just leave him. They stopped at Margie's Diner, a small, cozy restaurant Ruth used to love. The little bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, the scent of warm biscuits and fresh coffee wrapping around them like an old embrace. A waitress, Betty, an old friend of Ruth's, turned toward the entrance. Her eyes widened as she spotted Earl with a child. "Well, I'll be," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Earl Winters, is that a boy I see with you?" Earl felt Luke shift beside him, pressing a little closer. "Yes, ma'am," Earl said. "Figured we could use a warm meal." Betty's eyes softened as she took in Luke's worn jacket and thin frame. "Well, sit yourselves down. You're getting Ruth's special." Earl led Luke to a booth by the window, where the late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the table. Luke hesitated before climbing onto the seat, his small hands resting in his lap. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be there. "You like biscuits?" Earl asked. Luke nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "You ever had Ruth's biscuits?" Earl pressed. Luke glanced up, his dark eyes flickering with something. "She made the best ones," he said softly. Earl swallowed against the lump in his throat. "Yeah," he murmured. "She did." A few minutes later, Betty arrived with 2 plates of buttermilk biscuits, scrambled eggs, and thick slices of bacon. Luke stared at the food, his fingers curling slightly as if afraid it might disappear. "You go on. Now," Earl encouraged. Luke hesitated only a second longer before picking up a biscuit. He took a small, careful bite, then another, bigger one. His shoulders relaxed as warmth and nourishment filled him. Earl watched him eat, his own appetite slower, his mind swirled with thoughts. What was he going to do? He hadn't planned past this moment. Luke had a foster home, technically, but he didn't want to go back. Earl wasn't about to leave him on his own. But what could an old man like him do for a child? He had no answers. So, for now, he let the silence stretch between them, allowing the warmth of the diner and Ruth's memory to wrap around them like a familiar embrace. The shelter visit. After their meal, Earl made up his mind. He needed to know more about Luke's situation, and that meant visiting the shelter. Luke grew quieter as they approached the Oakwood Community Shelter. The small brick building sat nestled between old storefronts, its entrance lined with worn-out posters offering job listings, addiction recovery meetings, and free meals. It was a place Ruth had dedicated herself to, long before sickness had stolen her away. Earl pushed open the door, leading Luke inside. A woman at the front desk looked up, her lined face breaking into a surprised smile. "Mr. Winters. My goodness, I haven't seen you since." She stopped short, her smile fading slightly as her eyes flickered to Luke. Earl cleared his throat. "Mrs. Perkins, this here is Luke. I believe you know him." She exhaled, nodding. Yes, of course." Her gaze softened as she looked at the boy. "Luke, honey, where have you been?" Luke looked at the floor. Earl placed a firm but gentle hand on the boy's back. "I found him at Ruth's grave," he said, his voice steady. Told me she used to visit him here. Mrs. Perkins sighed. She did, she confirmed. Every single week. Ruth had a way of making the forgotten feel seen. Earl's heart clenched. Why's he in a foster home now? He asked. Mrs. Perkins hesitated, glancing at Luke. After his mother passed, social services placed him in a temporary home. It was only meant to be a short-term solution. But, she exhaled. He's still there. Earl frowned. And it ain't a good place. Mrs. Perkins looked hesitant to answer, but Luke spoke first. They don't care about me, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Earl's grip on the boy's back tightened slightly. Mrs. Perkins pursed her lips. Luke needs a real home, Mr. Winters, not just a place to stay. Earl met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Home. The word sat heavy in his chest. Earl had lived alone for a year now. His house, once warm and full of laughter, had become a place of silence. Could he change that? Could he give Luke what Ruth had started? A thought crept into his mind. A crazy, impossible thought. But before he could even entertain it, Mrs. Perkins' voice broke through his hesitation. Are you thinking what I think you're thinking, Mr. Winters? Earl swallowed hard. He looked down at Luke, who was still staring at the floor, small and fragile and alone. Earl took a deep breath. Would it be possible, he asked, voice steady, for me to take him in? Mrs. Perkins' lips parted slightly. Then she smiled. It's possible, she said. It won't be easy, but it's possible. Luke's head snapped up. His eyes widened in shock. You mean? He stopped himself, as if afraid to hope. Earl looked down at him, his heart twisting. How would you feel about coming home with me, son? He asked softly. Luke blinked rapidly, his fingers gripping the edge of his jacket. You mean it? He whispered. Earl nodded. Luke's lip quivered. He ducked his head, pressing his face against his sleeve for a moment. Then, without warning, he lunged forward and threw his arms around Earl. The old man stiffened in surprise. And then, slowly, he wrapped his arms around the boy. For the first time in a long, long time, Earl Winters didn't feel so alone. Neither did Luke. A new path forward. That night, as Earl prepared a spare bedroom for Luke, he paused by his late wife's portrait. It was an old photo, one taken when they were much younger. Ruth's warm eyes seemed to shine even through the glass. Earl exhaled. You knew what you were doing, didn't you? He murmured. The silence in the house didn't feel so empty anymore. For the first time in a long time, it felt like home. And as Luke curled up in his new bed down the hall, Earl Winters knew. This was just the beginning. The decision. Earl Winters had never expected his life to change at 73 years old. For the past year, his days had been a monotonous routine. Wake up, eat a quiet breakfast alone, visit Ruth's grave, and return to an empty house that no longer felt like home. Now, as he stood outside the spare bedroom, listening to the soft, steady breathing of a sleeping boy, his life had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. Luke was here. The house, once filled with an unbearable silence, now held something different, a presence, a warmth that had been missing since Ruth had passed. And it terrified Earl. He wasn't a father. He had never raised a child before. What if he wasn't cut out for this? What if he let Luke down? Earl sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. He turned toward the small table by the window where Ruth's old picture sat. He stared at it for a long moment. You knew about this, didn't you? He muttered. The silence didn't answer, but he swore he could almost hear Ruth's laughter. Morning changes everything. The next morning, Earl awoke to an unfamiliar sound. Footsteps. For a moment, his heart lurched, years of living alone making the noise feel foreign. But then he remembered. Luke. He pushed himself out of bed, joints aching as he shuffled toward the kitchen. Luke sat at the old wooden table, small hands curled around a cup of milk. He was staring down at the table, his face blank, his shoulders drawn inward. Earl cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Morning, son." Luke flinched slightly before looking up. "Morning," he said quietly. Earl glanced at the fridge. He wasn't much of a cook. Ruth had always handled the kitchen, but he wasn't about to let the boy go hungry. "You like pancakes?" Earl asked, reaching for the flour. Luke hesitated, then nodded. It took Earl longer than he liked to admit, but soon, a plate of golden pancakes sat between them. Luke stared at the food for a moment before taking a careful bite. "You cooked like Miss Ruth," Luke mumbled between bites. Earl froze for just a second, his throat tightening. "She taught me," he admitted. They ate in silence after that, the quiet not uncomfortable, but filled with something unspoken. And for the first time in over a year, breakfast wasn't lonely. The call that changed everything. Later that afternoon, Earl decided to take Luke back to the shelter, not to return him, but to make things official. Mrs. Perkins greeted them with a knowing smile. "I had a feeling I'd see you two again," she said, folding her arms. Earl nodded, glancing at Luke, who stood close to his side. "We need to talk." She led them into her office, a small room lined with overstuffed bookshelves and a desk covered in paperwork. Earl took a deep breath. "I want to take him in." Luke's head snapped up, eyes wide. Mrs. Perkins, however, didn't look surprised. "I thought you might say that." Earl exhaled. "I don't know a damn thing about raising kids, but I know I can't leave him in a place where he doesn't feel wanted." Mrs. Perkins softened. "You don't have to be perfect, Mr. Winters. You just have to be there." Luke looked between them, uncertainty flickering in his expression. You really mean it." Earl turned to face him, meeting the boy's gaze. "I wouldn't have said it if I didn't." Luke's lips pressed together tightly. "I don't want to be a burden." Earl's stomach twisted at the words. "You ain't a burden, son. You're family now." Luke's breath hitched slightly, and he looked away, blinking hard. Mrs. Perkins smiled softly. "We'll start the paperwork. It'll take some time, but we'll get everything sorted." Earl nodded. "All right then. Let's do this." Luke didn't say anything, but as they left the shelter that day, he stayed closer to Earl than before. And that was enough. Adjusting to a new life. Bringing Luke home wasn't just a change for the boy. It was a change for Earl too. For years, he had lived alone. The silence had been suffocating, yet familiar. Now suddenly, there were extra dishes in the sink, a second toothbrush in the bathroom, and most noticeably, there were tiny signs of life returning to the house. At first, Luke was hesitant. He moved quietly, as if afraid to disturb anything. He barely spoke unless spoken to. He seemed to be waiting, as if one wrong move would make this all disappear. Earl noticed. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Luke curled up in the corner of the couch, flipping through one of Ruth's old books. "You don't have to tiptoe around here, you know," Earl said suddenly. Luke stiffened slightly. Earl leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "This is your home now, son. You don't have to act like you're just passing through." Luke hesitated before whispering, "I don't know how to do that." Earl's chest tightened. "You will," he said gently, "one step at a time." Luke gave a small nod but didn't look up. But later that night, Earl heard something small but significant. As he passed Luke's bedroom door, he heard soft humming, a tune Ruth used to sing. It was the first sign of comfort, the first sign that Luke might finally be starting to believe he belonged. Ruth's legacy lives on. A few weeks passed, and things slowly began to shift. Luke began talking more. At first it was just simple things. "Can I have more syrup?" Or, "Where do you keep the extra blankets?" But then, it turned into stories. He told Earl about the books Ruth used to read him, about how she always smelled like vanilla, and how she once gave him a small, carved wooden bird because she said he reminded her of something meant to be free. Earl listened, soaking in every word. One day, while cleaning out an old closet, Earl found something that made his breath hitch. An old wooden box filled with Ruth's letters. Letters she had written to herself. Some were about Earl, some about her students, and some were about Luke. Earl's hands trembled as he read through them. I wish I could do more for him. He's such a bright boy. He deserves love, stability. I hope, one day, he finds a place where he truly belongs. Earl swallowed hard, blinking away tears. She had wanted this. She had wanted Luke to have a home. And somehow, in a way neither of them could have predicted, Earl had been the one to give it to him. Taking a deep breath, Earl folded the letter and placed it back into the box. Then he made a decision. Later that night, he walked into Luke's room and set the wooden bird on his bedside table. Luke looked up, surprised. Miss Ruth wanted you to have this, Earl said, and I think she'd be real glad you're here. Luke stared at the small carving, then at Earl. His lip quivered slightly. Then, slowly he whispered, Thank you. Earl nodded, swallowing past the tightness in his throat. Good night, son, he said softly. As he walked away, he heard Luke murmur something so quiet, he almost missed it. Good night, Dad. Earl's steps faltered. He turned slightly, but Luke had already curled up under the covers, his face hidden. Earl smiled. Ruth's love hadn't died with her. It had just found a new way to live on. And that night, for the first time in a long time, Earl Winters slept peacefully. A new beginning. A quiet shift in the house. Earl Winters had spent most of his life as a man of routine. Wake up at dawn, brew a pot of strong coffee, visit Ruth's grave, tend to the house, and sit in silence as the sun set behind the hills. But now things were changing. He woke up to the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway, Luke padding toward the kitchen before sunrise, shuffling around as he figured out how to start his own day. He heard laughter in the house again. Not loud or carefree just yet, but the quiet chuckles when Earl said something dryly sarcastic, or when Luke made some offhand comment about Earl's terrible cooking attempts. He found Ruth's books being read again. Luke would sit by the window, curled up in a blanket, nose buried in one of the books Ruth had left behind. He read aloud sometimes, softly, as if testing whether it was okay. And one day, Earl had surprised himself by sitting down next to him and listening. You know, Earl said, Ruth always used to read out loud like that when she was grading papers, said hearing the words made them feel more real. Luke hesitated, then turned a page. She did that at the shelter too, he murmured. Sometimes she let me read to her. Earl swallowed past the lump in his throat. Sounds like her. Luke smiled, small, but genuine. Facing the world together. Taking Luke in hadn't been the hard part. The hard part was making it real. Paperwork, meetings, home inspections. Earl hadn't had to deal with government offices since he retired. Now he was being asked 100 questions about his income, his health, his ability to care for a child. At one of the meetings, the caseworker, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Holloway, looked him over with skepticism. Mr. Winters, she said, tapping her pen against a folder. You're 73 years old. Raising a child is a lot to take on. Earl's jaw tightened. I ain't planning on running a marathon, if that's what you mean. She exhaled, glancing at Luke, who sat quietly beside him, staring at his hands. You understand, she continued. Luke has been through a lot of instability. This needs to be permanent. Earl nodded, his voice firm. I don't make promises I can't keep. Luke's eyes flickered toward him. Something settled between them then. A quiet understanding. A few weeks later, it became official. Luke Winters. Earl had never had children of his own. He had never expected to. Now, somehow, he had a son. Small steps toward healing. Earl didn't push Luke to talk about his past. He figured the boy would open up when he was ready. But one evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Luke finally spoke. My mom used to sing to me, he murmured, staring at the sky. Earl turned slightly. Yeah. Luke nodded. She had a pretty voice. Even when she got sick, she still sang when she could. His fingers curled around the armrest of the old rocking chair. After she died, I tried to remember the words, but they started fading. Earl let the silence settle before he responded. Memories change over time, he said, but the feeling stays. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then he whispered, I don't want to forget her. Earl's heart clenched. You won't, he promised. Luke hesitated. I still remember Miss Ruth's voice. Earl smiled. Hard to forget a voice like hers. A pause. Then softly. She used to hum when she cooked. Earl chuckled. That she did. Luke exhaled. I like that. Earl nodded. Me too, son, me too. And as they sat there in the fading light, Earl realized something. Luke wasn't just learning to trust him. He was learning to trust the world again. A storm and a breakthrough. One night, a storm rolled in. Earl had always liked the rain. Ruth used to say it made the house feel cozier. But as the thunder cracked outside, Earl noticed something. Luke was tense. He sat curled up on the couch, knees drawn to his chest, eyes flickering toward the windows every time lightning flashed. Son, Earl said gently, you all right? Luke nodded quickly. I'm fine. But he wasn't. Earl could see it, the tight grip on his sleeves, the slight tremor in his fingers. So, instead of pressing, Earl stood and walked to the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned with 2 mugs of hot cocoa. Luke blinked. What's that for? Earl sat down beside him, setting the mug on the table. Ruth used to make this every time there was a storm, he said. Said it helped. Luke hesitated before reaching for the cup. He took a small sip, then another. After a few moments, his shoulders relaxed. Earl leaned back in his chair. You know, storms don't last forever, he said, no matter how bad they seem. Luke stared into his cup. Yeah, he murmured. I guess they don't. And as the storm raged outside, Luke stayed close. And for the first time, Earl realized. Maybe the storms inside Luke were starting to pass too. A future together. One morning, Earl found Luke sitting at the table, staring at something in his hands. It was a photograph. An old one of Ruth, smiling, her eyes crinkled with warmth. Earl sat down across from him. That was taken on our honeymoon, he said. She made me pull over on the highway just to take that picture. Luke traced the edges of the photo. She looks happy. Earl smiled. She was. Luke hesitated, then asked, Do you think she'd be happy about this? Earl's chest tightened. Son, he said, voice thick with emotion, I think she's smilling down on us right now. Luke's lips twitched, his fingers tightening around the photo. And then softly, I miss her. Earl reached across the table, resting a hand on Luke's. I do too, he said, every day. Luke looked up, meeting Earl's gaze. But I'm glad we have each other, he whispered. Earl swallowed the lump in his throat. So am I, son, he murmured. So am I. And as they sat there, the morning sun streaming through the windows, Earl Winters knew. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement. This was family. This was home. Ruth's legacy. A year of changes. A full year had passed since Earl Winters had met Luke at Ruth's grave. A year since Earl had taken the boy home. Since they had both sat in silence, wondering if this new life together would work. Now, looking around his home, Earl barely recognized it. The once quiet and somber house had changed. There were signs of life everywhere. Luke's school books were stacked on the dining table. His sneakers sat by the front door. A baseball glove rested on the porch, alongside Earl's old rocking chair. The rooms felt full again. Luke had started leaving the door to his bedroom open. At first, it was just a crack, but now it was wide open, as if he no longer needed to keep himself hidden away. And Earl. He found himself waking up with purpose again. Each morning, he cooked breakfast, though Luke had politely suggested that maybe he should stick to toast and cereal. Earl had learned how to drive Luke to school, how to help with homework, even if math made his head spin, and how to sit through an entire superhero movie without falling asleep. They had settled into a routine, a life. And for the first time in a long time, Earl felt whole. Visiting Ruth. One cool autumn morning, Earl stood by the front door, holding a bouquet of fresh red roses. Luke walked up beside him, hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. "We going to see Miss Ruth?" Earl nodded. "It's been a while." Luke hesitated. "Can I bring something?" Earl looked at him in surprise. "Of course, son. What do you have in mind?" Luke chewed his lip, then disappeared into his room. He came back holding a small, carved wooden bird, the same one Ruth had given him at the shelter. "I want her to have it," he said softly. Earl's throat tightened, but he nodded. Together, they walked the familiar path to Oakwood Cemetery. The leaves had begun to turn golden, the scent of autumn heavy in the air. It was peaceful, as it always was. When they reached Ruth's grave, Earl knelt down, setting the roses gently against the polished stone. "Hey, sweetheart," he murmured. "We're here." Luke hesitated, then knelt beside him. Slowly, he placed the wooden bird at the base of the headstone. "Miss Ruth," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Earl swallowed hard. Luke took a shaky breath. "I think you'd be happy," he whispered. "I'm happy." Earl reached over, resting a hand on Luke's back. For a long time, they sat there together, letting the wind carry their words. And in that moment, Earl could almost hear Ruth's voice in the rustling leaves. She was still with them. Always. A home. A family. A few weeks later, Earl found himself standing in the kitchen, watching as Luke carefully poured pancake batter onto a griddle. "Careful now," Earl warned. "Too much and it'll spill over." Luke grinned. "I got this, old man." Earl chuckled. "That's so." Luke nodded, flipping the pancake with a flourish. Miss Ruth would have said, "I'm a natural." Earl's chest warmed at the mention of her name. "Yeah," he murmured. "She would have." Luke finished cooking, setting 2 plates on the table. As they sat down to eat, Earl couldn't help but marvel at how different his life had become. A year ago, he had been alone, lost. Now he had a son, a family. And for the first time, in a long, long time, Earl Winters felt at peace.